The year is 1582. Japan is burning. Not metaphorically, literally. The country has been at war with itself for over a century. Warlords rise and fall like seasons. Alliances are made at dinner and broken before dawn. Entire clans are erased from history, not by foreign invasion, but by neighbors who smiled at them the week before. In this world, survival is not guaranteed by strength alone. It requires something else: information, deception, the ability to be somewhere without being seen, to know what your enemy is planning before he plans it, to move through the darkness of a country at war and leave no trace of your passage except the consequences. In this world, one name moves differently than others. Not loudly, not openly. The way a shadow moves, at the edge of perception, gone before you can confirm it was ever there. Hattori Hanzo. Most people who recognize that name encountered it through film, through the mythological, cinematic version of a ninja master, ancient, silent, forging legendary blades in a workshop at the edge of the world. That version is fiction, but the truth behind it is stranger, more complex, and in many ways more disturbing than any screenplay could fully contain. Because the real Hattori Hanzo was not a myth. He was a man, a specific, documented, historically verifiable man who operated at the center of one of the most violent and consequential periods in Japanese history. A man whose skills were so refined, whose loyalty was so absolute, and whose methods were so effective that within his own lifetime he had already become something beyond human in the minds of those who feared him. And many people feared him, with very good reason. To understand Hattori Hanzo, you first need to understand the world that created him, because men like Hanzo do not emerge from peaceful societies. They are not produced by stability or comfort or the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. They are produced by chaos, by generations of violence so sustained and so total that an entirely separate class of warrior evolves, not to fight on open battlefields in the sunlight, but to operate in the spaces between battles, in the darkness between decisions, in the silence before everything changes. Japan's Sengoku period, the era of the warring states, began in the mid-15th century and would not fully resolve until the early 20th. For roughly 150 years, the country had no effective central authority. The emperor existed but held no real power. The shogunate had collapsed into irrelevance. What remained was a landscape of competing warlords, each controlling a territory, each building armies, each watching their neighbors with the particular intensity of men who understood that the difference between ruling and dying was a single night's intelligence. Into that landscape, into that specific, desperate, and information-hungry environment, the ninja clans were born. And the most feared of those clans came from a place called Iga. Iga province sits in the mountains of what is now Mie Prefecture in central Japan. It is not an obvious place to produce the most feared intelligence operatives in Japanese history. It has no coastline, no major trade routes, no natural resources that would make it strategically valuable in the conventional sense. What it has is mountains. Dense, layered, disorienting mountains that made conventional military invasion extraordinarily difficult. Mountains that created natural isolation, communities that developed inward, that built their own systems of governance, their own codes, their own methods of survival that had no need to reference the outside world for validation. In that isolation, over generations, something specific was cultivated. The people of Iga learned that the mountains protecting them could also be used offensively. That knowledge of terrain, absolute, generational, bone-deep knowledge of every path and cave and blind valley, was itself a weapon. That a small group of people who knew their land perfectly could defeat a much larger force that didn't. From that insight, over decades, a complete system evolved. Not just physical skills, though those were refined to a degree that seemed to outsiders almost supernatural, but intelligence gathering, disguise, psychological manipulation, the art of becoming invisible not through magic, but through a precise understanding of how human attention works and how to move around it. This system had a name: ninjutsu. Hattori Hanzo was born into this world in 1542. His family had been practitioners of Iga ninjutsu for generations. His father served the Matsudaira clan, a family that would later become one of the most consequential in Japanese history under a different name. From childhood, Hanzo was trained not as a conventional samurai, but as something that occupied a more complex position in the military hierarchy. He was trained to do what samurai could not. Samurai operated within a rigid code, the Bushido. They fought openly, in formation, under banners, in daylight. Their honor was visible. Their methods were governed by rules that everyone understood. There was a clarity to samurai warfare that, paradoxically, made it predictable. Ninja operated in the space that predictability created. Where a samurai could not go without compromising his honor, a ninja went without hesitation. Where a samurai's announced his presence, a ninja erased his. Where a samurai's effectiveness depended on being seen, on the psychological impact of an army advancing across a field, a ninja's effectiveness depended entirely on never being confirmed. Hanzo understood this distinction from childhood, and he built his entire life around exploiting it. His first documented military action occurred when he was 16 years old. 16. In 1558, during a night raid on Udo Castle, the young Hanzo performed with a precision and effectiveness that his commanding officers found difficult to explain in conventional military terms. The details of what exactly he did that night are partially obscured by the distance of history and the deliberate secrecy that surrounded ninja operations. But the outcome was not obscured. The raid succeeded. Hanzo's role in that success was noted by people whose attention mattered, and from that point forward, his trajectory within the Matsudaira military structure moved in only one direction: upward, rapidly. But here is what makes Hanzo's story more than a simple chronicle of military skill. It is not enough to be effective in a world like Sengoku Japan. Effectiveness without loyalty is just a weapon waiting to change hands. What elevated Hanzo above the dozens of other skilled ninja operatives of his era, what made him specifically indispensable rather than merely dangerous, was the nature of his relationship with one particular man. A man that at the time Hanzo entered his service was not yet powerful, not yet famous, not yet the figure history would eventually make him. He was simply a young lord from a minor clan, navigating a world designed to destroy people exactly like him. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and the story of what Hanzo did for him, the specific, documented, almost unbelievable thing he did on a single day in 1582, is the reason we are still talking about Hattori Hanzo today. To understand what Hanzo did in 1582, you need to understand what happened on June 21st of that year. Oda Nobunaga was the most powerful warlord in Japan, a man of extraordinary military genius and extraordinary brutality. He had spent decades dismantling the old feudal order through tactical innovation and a complete willingness to do what his contemporaries considered unthinkable. He was closer than anyone before him to unifying the entire country under a single authority. And then, in a temple in Kyoto called Honnoji, one of his own generals turned against him. Akechi Mitsuhide surrounded the temple in the early hours of the morning. Nobunaga, caught without his army with only a small personal guard, understood immediately what was happening. He fought, and when fighting became impossible, he died inside the burning temple on his own terms, denying his enemies the satisfaction of taking him alive. The most powerful man in Japan was gone in a single morning. What nobody had planned for was what that morning meant for the man standing in Nobunaga's shadow, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu received the news the same day. He was in Sakai, a merchant city near modern Osaka, essentially unprotected. His army was days away. The roads between him and safety passed through territory now controlled by Mitsuhide and watched by warlords already moving to exploit the vacuum Nobunaga's death had created. Ieyasu was exposed, alone, and every enemy he had ever made knew it. This was the moment Hattori Hanzo stepped out of the shadows of military support and into the center of history. What he did next was not a single dramatic act. It was a logistical operation of extraordinary complexity, executed under lethal time pressure, through hostile mountain terrain, with the future of Japan depending on every decision he made. Hanzo activated the Iga network. Hundreds of ninja, his own people, scattered across the mountains in civilian lives, available for exactly this kind of moment, were mobilized. Not to fight a battle, to move one man safely through terrain his enemies would never think to watch, through passes that appeared on no military map, through routes that only someone with generational knowledge of those mountains could navigate at speed, in summer heat, under pursuit. The journey was brutal. There were skirmishes, there were moments where the entire operation balanced on decisions made in seconds in the dark. Ieyasu arrived home alive because Hattori Hanzo knew which paths to take when everything was burning. Follow that survival forward through time and the weight of it becomes almost incomprehensible. Tokugawa Ieyasu went on to unify Japan completely. In 1603, he established the Tokugawa shogunate, a dynasty that would govern Japan for over 250 years. The Edo period that followed became one of the longest stretches of internal stability in Japanese history, a transformation of an entire civilization built on the foundation of one man's survival. A survival that traces directly back to one night in the mountains of Iga, to one man who knew the darkness better than his enemies knew the light. After Ieyasu's escape, Hanzo's position changed fundamentally. He was no longer simply a skilled operative within a larger military structure. He became something rarer and more dangerous, the personal guardian of the man who would remake Japan. Ieyasu gave him command of the Iga warriors who had settled in Edo, the city that would become the beating heart of the new shogunate, a force of several hundred men answerable to no one except Hanzo, deployed at the discretion of no one except Ieyasu. The area they guarded still exists today. In modern Tokyo, there is a district near the imperial palace called Hanzomon, Hanzo's Gate, named not for a legend, named for a man who stood there in the early years of a new Japan, watching the roads that led to the most powerful person in the country. He was the last line, and everyone who understood how power worked in that world knew it. But here is what history rarely pauses to examine. What does it cost a man to live that way? To exist for decades in the permanent posture of anticipating violence? To see every unfamiliar face as a potential threat? To build your entire identity around a loyalty so absolute that your own survival is always secondary to someone else's? Hanzo never stopped being useful. The records do not show a man who relaxed into comfort when the danger passed. They show a man who remained in position, watchful, disciplined, present, until the very end. He died in 1596, still serving, still watching the gate. Hattori Hanzo left no memoir, no philosophical treatise, no account of his own life written in his own hand. What remains is what others recorded: military logs, clan documents, the occasional reference in chronicles written by people who were trying to make sense of a Japan that Hanzo had helped create. He understood perhaps better than anyone, that the most effective presence leaves the smallest trace. He lived by that principle, and he died by it. What the legend consumed, what the films and the mythology absorbed and distorted beyond recognition, was never really about the man. It was about what the man represented. Because every society that has ever existed has needed to believe in something that operates beyond the visible rules, something that moves in the spaces ordinary power cannot reach, something that protects the things worth protecting not through spectacle or declaration, but through silence and precision and an absolute refusal to be seen until the moment seeing is no longer possible. Hanzo was that thing made human, made specific, made historical, made real in a way that myth never quite manages. The gate that bears his name still stands. Millions of people pass it yearly in modern Tokyo. Most of them do not know whose name they are walking past. Most of them do not know that the man behind that name saved a life, that built a dynasty, that shaped a civilization that produced the city they are standing in. History works that way sometimes. The most consequential moments happen in darkness, in mountains, in the space between one world ending and another beginning, witnessed by no one, remembered only by the gate.